A young lawyer once held a bag stuffed with $1.5 million in stolen money no one would ever miss, and he gave back every dollar because keeping it would have been wrong. That same man would one day help a drug kingpin hide his fortune and cover up the deaths of innocent people without blinking. Somewhere between those two men, a good person slowly disappeared, and you can never quite point to the moment it happened. This is the story of how Jimmy McGill became Saul Goodman. One small, reasonable choice at a time, a long and quiet slide that began with a single cruel sentence from his own brother. By the end, you may see that the good man was never truly destroyed. He was only buried. Across what follows, we walk through 10 moments that trace the whole fall. Welcome to Between the Episodes. Let's begin. Section 1. The Brother Who Said No. Before there was a man named Saul Goodman, there was a man named Jimmy McGill. And before Jimmy McGill became someone the law could not trust, he was someone who wanted, more than almost anything, to be trusted by the law. That is the quiet thing sitting underneath his whole story. The man who would one day help criminals hide stolen money and lie without his face ever changing began as a man trying his hardest to be good, not perfect, just good enough to be let in. Jimmy did not come from money or comfort. He grew up in a town called Cicero, close to Chicago, and as a young man he made his living the way small crooks do. He ran little tricks. He talked people out of small amounts of cash. The folks back home called him Slippin' Jimmy, partly because he was slippery, and partly because he once faked a fall on a patch of ice to collect money he had no right to. He never hurt anyone. He was the kind of crook who worked with a grin and a good story. But a crook was what he was, and everyone who knew him knew it. Jimmy had an older brother named Chuck. Chuck was everything Jimmy was not, at least on paper. He was calm where Jimmy was loud. He was respected where Jimmy was laughed at. Chuck was one of the best lawyers in the whole state, a man who had helped build a large and powerful law firm with his own name on the door. To Jimmy, Chuck was not just a brother. Chuck was proof that a McGill could be someone serious, someone people looked up to. And years earlier, when Slippin' Jimmy got into the kind of trouble that could have ruined his life for good, it was Chuck who used his standing as a lawyer to pull him back out of it. Jimmy never forgot that. He spent a long time feeling like he owed his brother everything. So Jimmy tried to change. He really did. He moved across the country to Albuquerque, where Chuck lived and worked. He took a job in the mailroom of Chuck's firm, sorting letters and pushing carts, doing the smallest work in the building. And in his free time, late at night and on weekends, he studied law in secret. He could not get into a real law school, so he earned his degree from a tiny, far-off school that taught its classes by mail and over a slow computer connection. He failed the test to become a lawyer twice. He kept going. On the third try, he passed. He had done it. He had turned himself from a con man into an attorney, all on his own through pure, stubborn effort. Then came the part that broke his heart, even if it took him a long time to understand it. The firm never gave him a job as a lawyer. Chuck's firm, the place Jimmy had bled for, kept him in the mailroom in his mind even after he passed the bar. So Jimmy went out on his own. He set up a tiny office in the back of a nail salon, a cramped little room he could barely afford. He drove a car that was falling apart and held together with the wrong color door. He took the cases nobody else wanted, defending people for almost no money, scraping by week to week. And through all of it, he kept showing up for Chuck. By this time, Chuck had become a sick man, or at least he believed he had. Chuck was convinced that electricity hurt his body, that lights and phones and ordinary machines made him weak and ill. He stopped leaving his house. He wrapped himself in a shiny blanket to block what he thought was harming him. He stored his food in coolers and lit his rooms with a gas lantern, living like a man hiding from the modern world. And it was Jimmy who took care of him. Jimmy carried in groceries. Jimmy made sure the ice was fresh and the canisters of fuel were full. Jimmy treated his brother with a patience that few people would have managed. There is a moment early in Jimmy's story, in the 9th chapter of the show's first season, that shows exactly how tender this all once was. Jimmy gets Chuck to do something Chuck has not done in ages. He helps him step outside the house and sit on a bench in the open air. Chuck is nervous. His eyes keep darting to the power lines overhead. But Jimmy stays gentle and steady, and slowly he talks his brother into taking off his shoes and feeling the grass under his bare feet. For a few seconds, Chuck relaxes. The sun is on his face. The two brothers sit side by side, and it looks like things might finally be turning toward the good. They head back inside and pick up their work together on a big case, the kind of case that could matter. Jimmy is happy. He thinks his brother is healing, and he thinks they are a team. The way this scene is built makes the warmth feel real and earned. The camera stays close on the two men. There is no loud music pushing the feeling at the audience. The actors play it small and human, all soft voices and careful movements, so that the bond between the brothers reads as the most natural thing in the world. Anyone watching would believe these two love each other. That belief is important because of what comes next. Jimmy figures out the truth almost by accident. He notices that Chuck used his phone the night before. Even though Chuck claims phones make him ill, he follows the thread of it in his head, and the whole rotten picture comes together. Chuck was the one calling the head of the firm. Chuck was the one making sure Jimmy never got hired. For all this time, Jimmy had blamed the firm's smooth boss for keeping him down, when the person blocking the door was his own brother. The brother he had been spoon-feeding groceries and carrying through his illness. Jimmy drives to Chuck's house and lays it out plainly. He tells Chuck that he knows Chuck called the firm. He says it simply, "You did not want me." And Chuck, cornered, finally tells his brother the thing he has been holding back for years. Chuck says that Jimmy is not a real lawyer. He sneers at the tiny far-off school Jimmy graduated from. He says he gave his entire life to the law, that he worked himself to the bone for his place in it, and that Jimmy thinks he can slide into the same world through a side door and collect the same respect. Then he says the line that the whole story turns on. He tells Jimmy that people do not change. He says that slippin' Jimmy with a law degree is like a chimp with a machine gun. That sentence lands like a slap. Jimmy stands there and takes it. The hurt moves across his face slowly, and then it goes blank. The way a person looks when something inside them quietly gives out. He asks the smallest, saddest question a brother can ask. He says he thought Chuck was proud of him. And Chuck answers that he was proud once, back when Jimmy worked in the mailroom and knew his place. The message is clear. Chuck was happy to have Jimmy as a beaten-down little brother. The idea of Jimmy as an equal, a fellow lawyer, was the thing he could not stand. Jimmy does not yell. He does not throw anything. He tells Chuck that he has left him enough supplies for a few days, the ice and the food, fuel, and that after that, Chuck is on his own. He says he is done. Then he walks out to his broken car and drives off, and Chuck stands in the doorway, calling his name into the empty street, watching him go. Underneath the surface of this fight, the show is saying something careful about both men. Chuck is not angry because Jimmy is bad. Chuck is angry because he is afraid that Jimmy might get the one thing Chuck values most, a place in the law without paying the long, hard price that Chuck paid. He cannot bear the thought that the rules he gave his life to could be bent by a man he sees as a clown. And for Jimmy, the lesson is even simpler and even crueler. The person he loved most, the person he had been trying to make proud for years, never believed in him at all. The work, the studying, the failed tests, the late nights, the years in the mailroom, all of it was aimed at earning the approval of a man who had already decided long ago that it would never come. This is the scene that fans return to again and again as the key to everything that follows. The chimp line became one of the most repeated lines in the entire series. The kind of thing people say to each other long after they have forgotten the episode it came from. People quote it because it is sharp and a little funny, and that surface cleverness can hide how much damage it did. Said by a stranger, it would be a clever insult. Said by a brother to a brother after years of quiet care, it is a kind of small killing. The show had been hinting at where Jimmy might be headed even before this. Earlier in the same chapter, Jimmy says something to a frightened client that sounds almost like a warning about himself. He tells the man that he never called him a bad guy. He only called him a criminal. In Jimmy's world, those are two different things. And the difference is the thread he keeps trying to walk along. A person can break the rules and still not be a monster. That belief is the thin rope Jimmy has been balancing on his whole life, and Chuck has just cut one end of it. What makes this hurt so widely is that almost everyone has felt some smaller version of it. The wish to be respected by a parent, a brother, a sister, a teacher, someone whose opinion sits heavy in the heart. The slow effort to earn it, and then the cold discovery that the door was locked from the start. The pain here is not loud or bloody. It is one quiet sentence, said in a calm voice, by a man whose voice used to mean everything. That is the kind of wound that does not bleed where people can see it. The slow corruption of Jimmy McGill begins right here, on an ordinary afternoon, with a single conversation. It begins with a wound, given by the one person whose belief in him might have held him on the honest path. Jimmy had been good for a reason. He had been good to prove Chuck wrong, and to make Chuck proud, and to earn his way into Chuck's world. Once he learns that the reason was empty all along, the goodness has nothing to hold on to. He does not become a bad man in this moment. He does nothing terrible at all. He simply leaves a few days of food and drives away. But a man who has lost the reason he was trying has to find some new reason to be anything, and the search for that new reason is where the trouble truly starts. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The thing that held Jimmy steady has come loose, and a loose thing always slides somewhere. Very soon he will be handed one last clean chance at the respectable life he always claimed to want. And standing right at the door of it, he will turn around and walk the other way, saying a few quiet words to himself that sound like a man setting himself free. Section 2. The road he chose. Grief and anger twist together in ways that are hard to pull apart. And in the days after his brother told him the truth, Jimmy McGill carried both at once. He kept doing his work because the work was all he had. He still had his elderly clients, the old folks he had been helping with wills and small legal matters. And he still showed up for them with a smile pasted on. But the smile had nothing behind it anymore. The reason he had been good was gone, and he was walking around with a hole where that reason used to be. There is a scene at the start of the show's first season finale that shows just how close to breaking he was. Jimmy is at a retirement home, calling out numbers for a game of bingo to a room full of seniors. It should be an easy, cheerful job. But the letter B keeps coming up on his little balls, over and over. And each B seems to land on him like a small punch. He starts to drift. The cheer drains out of his voice. And then, in front of all those confused old people, he cracks open and starts telling them a story from his past that he has clearly never told anyone there before. He tells them about something called a Chicago sunroof. Back home, years earlier, there was a man named Chet who had wronged Jimmy badly. The man owed him money and had been with Jimmy's wife. So one night, drunk and furious, Jimmy climbed on top of the man's fancy car and relieved himself down through the open sunroof. It was a crude, ugly act of revenge, the kind of thing a small-time crook does when he feels powerless. What Jimmy did not know was that the man's 2 young children were sitting in the back seat behind dark-tinted windows. That one detail turned a nasty prank into something far worse in the eyes of the law, something that nearly branded Jimmy as a dangerous man for the rest of his life. And it was Chuck, the brother who now called him a joke, who had stepped in and used his power as a lawyer to pull him out of it. The bingo crowd does not really understand the story. Jimmy is not telling it for them. He is telling it for himself, dragging his shame out into the open because he can no longer hold it in. After that, Jimmy gets in his car and drives a very long way. He goes back home, back to Cicero near Chicago, back to the streets where Slippin' Jimmy used to live. And there he finds his old partner, a man named Marco. Marco was Jimmy's best friend and his partner in crime from the old days. The two of them used to run cons together, pulling little tricks on strangers in bars and on street corners, splitting whatever they earned. When Jimmy left town years before to follow Chuck to New Mexico and try to go straight, Marco had not wanted him to go. In a quiet flashback, the show lets the audience see that goodbye. Marco is hurt and confused. He tells Jimmy that watching him give up the con. Life is like watching a great musician give up his instrument. To Marco, the cons were not just a way to make money. They were the thing Jimmy was best at in the whole world, the thing that made him special. And now, Jimmy was throwing it away. 10 years later, Jimmy walks back into that same bar and finds Marco sitting in almost the exact same spot, like a wind-up toy that someone left running in an empty room. Marco never moved on, never changed. He is older and a little softer, but he is still there, still telling the same stories, still waiting for something to happen. And the moment he sees Jimmy, his whole face lights up. The two of them fall back into their old rhythm right away. They start with one of their classic routines, a trick built around a coin, an old $50 that they convince a stranger is worth a small fortune. It works like a charm. The mark walks away thinking he got a great deal, and the two friends pocket the cash and grin at each other, like no time has passed at all. What follows is a week of pure joy, and the show films it like one. There is a long stretch where the two of them run con after con, night after night, all over the city. The lighting is warm, the music is bright and bouncy. Marco laughs, Jimmy laughs, and the man on the screen looks nothing like the gray, beaten-down lawyer who sat behind a nail salon taking cases for pocket change. This Jimmy is loose and alive. His eyes shine. He is quick and clever, and completely in his element. The show is making a quiet point with all that warmth and light. The happiest the audience has ever seen Jimmy McGill is right now, breaking the law with his oldest friend. The honest care for that point sits in the small details. The way Odenkirk plays the cons with his whole body relaxed, his shoulders dropped, his grin easy. The way the camera lingers on the fun of it instead of cutting away in judgment. There is no grim music telling the audience that this is wrong. The week simply looks like the best time of Jimmy's life, because to Jimmy, it is. A few times during that week, Jimmy's phone buzzes with messages, and the messages pull at something in him. They are from Kim, the woman he cares about back in Albuquerque, and she has news. A big and respected law firm has taken an interest in the large case Jimmy helped uncover, and they want to talk to him. It is the chance Jimmy spent years dreaming about, the doorway into the clean, well-paid, respectable kind of law he always claimed he wanted. When Jimmy hears her voice on those messages, a flicker of guilt crosses his face. Some part of him knows he is supposed to want that life. Some part of him remembers that he is supposed to be trying. The week ends in a way Jimmy never sees coming. In the middle of one last con, the two friends working a stranger together the way they always have, Marco suddenly clutches his chest and goes down. His heart gives out right there. Jimmy drops everything and rushes to him, but there is nothing to be done. Marco is dying in a dirty alley, in the middle of the only thing he ever truly loved doing, and as he goes, he tells Jimmy how much that final week meant to him. How it was the best stretch of time he had known in years. Then he is gone. Jimmy takes the ring off his friend's finger, a small pinky ring Marco always wore, and he slides it onto his own hand. He will wear that ring for the rest of his life, through everything that is coming, a small circle of metal that carries the weight of who he used to be. Jimmy goes back to Albuquerque a changed man, though the change is hidden under his usual face. He goes to the meeting. He walks into the parking garage of the big firm, dressed up, ready to step through that long-dreamed-of door and begin the respectable life. And then he stops. He sits there in his car, he thinks. And instead of going up to the meeting, he drives over to the little booth where his quiet acquaintance, Mike, works as a parking attendant. Jimmy needs to say something out loud, and Mike is the only one around to hear it. He brings up a thing that happened months earlier. There had been a bag with about $1.5 million of stolen money in it. Money that two crooked clients had hidden away. Jimmy had that money in his hands. He could have kept it and walked away rich, and he gave it back because it was the right thing to do. Jimmy asks the question that has been eating at him. He gave back a fortune to do the right thing, and what did doing the right thing ever get him? A back room behind a nail salon. A car held together with the wrong color door. A brother who thinks he is a clown with a law degree. He looks at Mike and says the thing that closes the book on the first part of his life. He says he knows what stopped him from keeping that money. And then he says that it is never stopping him again. He does not go to the meeting. He starts his car and drives away from the respectable firm and everything it offered. He has Marco's ring on his finger. He is humming Marco's favorite song, an old rock tune. And he is smiling, the same loose, alive smile he wore all week in Cicero. He is driving towards something new, and he looks lighter than he has looked in a very long time. The thing that makes this moment matter so much is that no one is forcing Jimmy to do any of it. There is no villain in the parking garage twisting his arm. The good road is right there, easy to take, fully open. He just turns away from it on his own. Chuck's cruel words in the last section took away the reason Jimmy had been holding himself to the straight and narrow. The week with Marco showed Jimmy who he is when no one is watching and no rules apply. And the answer is that he is happy. Marco's death drove the lesson all the way home. Life is short, the clean road led nowhere, and the only time Jimmy ever felt fully himself was when he was bending the world to his will with a clever lie. This is the first real step in the slow fall of Jimmy McGill, And it is a strange kind of step because he does not hurt a single soul to take it. He commits no great crime in that garage. He simply decides, all the way down, to stop fighting his own nature. The wound came from Chuck. The choice belongs to Jimmy. From here on, when chances to bend the rules appear, he will not wrestle with himself the way he used to. The little voice that once made him give back a bag full of money has been told, plainly and for good, to be quiet. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. And the next time Jimmy reaches for his old bag of tricks, the target will not be some stranger in a bar with a fake coin between them. He will aim everything he learned on the streets of Cicero at the one person who hurt him most, and a handful of numbers quietly changed on a single page will end up doing more damage than any street con he ever pulled. Section 3. The numbers on the page. Kim Wexler worked harder for less reward than almost anyone in Jimmy's life. She was a lawyer too, sharp and careful, the kind of person who double-checked everything and never cut a corner. For a long time, she had worked at the same big, respected firm that Chuck helped run, the one that kept Jimmy stuck in the mailroom in their minds. Kim and Jimmy had grown close over the years, close enough that her good opinion of him mattered more to him than just about anyone else's. And by this point in the story, Kim had made a brave decision. She wanted to leave the safety of the big firm and start out on her own. To do that, she needed clients. The most important one she had lined up was a small bank called Mesa Verde, a bank that wanted to grow and open new branches. Kim had courted Mesa Verde herself. She had done the work, built the trust, and earned the chance to handle their legal business as she struck out on her own. That single client could be the thing that made her new life possible. Then, Chuck and his firm took Mesa Verde away from her. They went to the bank's owner and convinced him that a big, powerful firm was the safer choice than one lawyer working alone. It was a smooth, legal, perfectly allowed move, and it was also a quiet kind of cruelty. Kim had done all the hard work, and the reward got pulled out of her hands by the same firm she was trying to leave, with Chuck right at the center of it. She did not cry about it. She squared her shoulders and got ready to start over from nothing. But Jimmy saw what it did to her, and Jimmy was furious. That anger met the new Jimmy, the one who had decided in a parking garage that he was done holding himself back. He had spent a short, unhappy stretch at a fancy firm by now and found that the buttoned-up life did not fit him. He and Kim were beginning to build something together, sharing a small office, two lonely lawyers betting on each other. So when Jimmy looked at the wrong done to Kim, he did not wrestle with himself for very long. He reached for the only tool he had ever truly trusted, the trick. The trick was small enough to fit in the palm of a hand. Chuck refused to use computers because of his illness, so all of his important work was done on paper, printed pages he kept in his home. The Mesa Verde paperwork that Chuck planned to file with the state, the documents that would let the bank open its new branch, listed the address of that branch. The real address was 1261 Rosella Drive. Jimmy got hold of the documents at a late-night copy shop and changed two of the numbers. He swapped them around so the address now read 1216 Rosella Drive. Then he made sure the changed pages ended up back in Chuck's careful, trusting hands so that Chuck would carry them into an important meeting without ever guessing a thing. What happened next was almost painful to watch because of how proud Chuck was walking into it. Chuck dressed up for the hearing in front of the state's banking board. He was sure of himself, the way a man is sure when he has built his whole life on being right. He even joked that he found victory laps very comforting. He believed this would be an easy win, a simple stamp of approval. One more proof that his careful, lifelong devotion to the law always paid off. Standing before the board, with the bank's owner and his right-hand woman beside him, Chuck read the branch's address out loud. He said 1216 Rosella Drive, the false address Jimmy had planted. The bank's own people knew their real address. They corrected him. And here the trap snapped shut, because Chuck could not believe he had made a mistake. He had never made a mistake like that in his life, so he argued. He insisted his paperwork was perfect, even as the client sat there telling him he was wrong. The more he dug in, the worse he looked, like a proud man losing his grip in public. The board lost confidence. They called off the meeting and forced a delay of 6 weeks, a delay that would cost the bank a great deal of money. The fallout came fast. Mesa Verde, embarrassed and annoyed, fired Chuck's big firm and went back to Kim, the very lawyer they had left behind. Jimmy's trick had done exactly what he wanted. Kim got her client, Chuck got humiliated, and on the surface, it all looked like an honest slip by an aging man whose health was failing. But Chuck was brilliant, and Jimmy underestimated him. When Jimmy and Kim came to Chuck's house to pick up the Mesa Verde files, Jimmy's key would not turn in the lock. Chuck had changed the locks. Inside, Chuck looked his brother in the eye and laid out, step by step, exactly how Jimmy had done it. He described the late-night copy shop, the swapped numbers, the whole plan, getting nearly every detail right. He had no proof, only certainty, but the certainty was total. Jimmy stood there and played dumb, wearing the innocent, wounded face of a man falsely accused. Chuck then turned to Kim and gave her a hard choice. She could tell the clients the truth about the forged documents and protect her honor, or she could stay quiet and risk her own career if the truth ever came out. Kim chose Jimmy. In front of Chuck, she defended him, brushing off the accusation as the bitter guess of a sick man. It was a moment of real loyalty, and it was also a moment that pulled Kim a step into Jimmy's world. Because the second they were alone in the car, Kim turned and punched Jimmy hard in the arm. She knew. She had known the whole time. She had defended a lie to Chuck's face and kept his secret, and now she had to carry it. Later that night, she warned him plainly. If he had left any trace, any thread leading back to him, Chuck would find it. Her warning sent Jimmy back out into the dark to clean up after himself. And that is where the worst part of the night unfolded. Jimmy realized the clerk at the copy shop could ruin everything by remembering his face. He drove there to silence the man with money, but Chuck had been thinking the same thing. Chuck had sent his loyal assistant out to check every all-night copy shop in town. And when Jimmy arrived, the assistant was already inside, talking to the very clerk who could identify him. The clerk confirmed that yes, he remembered Jimmy. The assistant left to go fetch Chuck. As soon as he was gone, Jimmy slipped in and bribed the clerk to forget, to change his story, to claim he had never seen the man in the photo. Then Chuck arrived, shaking with anger and weak from his illness, certain he was about to catch his brother at last. The clerk looked at the photo and said he did not recognize anyone. Chuck could not understand it. He could feel the truth slipping through his fingers, and the harder he reached for it, the dizzier he became. His own body turned against him. He grew confused, lost his balance, and fell, striking his head hard against a counter. He crumpled to the floor. Across the street, hidden in the dark, Jimmy watched it happen. He saw his brother go down, and he stayed where he was. He did not run in to help. He stood frozen, partly in shock and partly in something colder. The understanding that helping would mean getting caught. The man who once spoon-fed his sick brother groceries now watched that same brother fall and bleed, and chose to protect himself instead. The cruelty of this whole plan hides inside how tiny it was. 2 numbers swapped on a page, that is all. No weapon, no threat, no shouting. A small, clever, almost invisible act. And from those 2 swapped numbers came a public humiliation, a fired firm, a betrayed client, a brother's pride shattered, and a man bleeding on a copy shop floor. The size of the trick and the size of the damage do not match, and that gap is the whole point. Jimmy had found a way to do enormous harm with a feather touch. The kind of harm that leaves no fingerprints, the kind a clever man can always tell himself was not really his fault. And that is exactly what Jimmy did. He told himself a story to make it bearable. He told himself this was for Kim, that he was righting a wrong, that Chuck had started it by stealing her client. There was a sliver of truth in that story, which is what made it so easy to believe. Chuck had been cruel to Kim. Jimmy was protecting someone he loved. But underneath the story sat the plain fact that Jimmy had committed real fraud, the serious, career-ending kind, against his own brother, and had aimed his oldest talents straight at the one man who could be hurt by it the most. This is the moment the slow fall stops being a private feeling and becomes an action with victims. In the last part of the story, Jimmy only decided, deep in his heart, to stop fighting his nature. He harmed no one. Here, he reaches out and does damage in the real world to a real person, with a cool head and a ready excuse. The wound that Chuck carved into him has begun to flow the other way, back toward Chuck as harm. And the most troubling part is how good Jimmy is at it, and how quickly he found a reason to feel fine about it. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The fall in the copy shop would heal, but the grudge would not. Chuck got back up more certain than ever that his brother was a liar, and now he had a burning need to prove it. Soon he would find a clever way to get Jimmy to admit everything out loud and capture it, and that single recording would drag both brothers toward one terrible afternoon in a courtroom, where one of them would be broken in front of a room full of people and never truly recover. Section 4. The battery in the pocket. The cut on Chuck's head healed in a few weeks. The anger underneath it did not. After the night he collapsed on the copy shop floor, Chuck became a man with a single purpose, and that purpose was proving that his brother was a liar. He was certain Jimmy had forged the Mesa Verde papers. He had no proof, only the deep, bone-level knowing of a man who understood exactly how his little brother's mind worked, and a brilliant lawyer with a grudge and a lifetime of cleverness is a patient and dangerous thing. To understand how cruel the courtroom afternoon would become, it helps to remember what these 2 brothers once were to each other. Years earlier, before the war between them, Chuck was trying to win back his ex-wife, a kind woman named Rebecca. Chuck had dinner with her at his home, hoping to mend things. But Chuck was already hiding his strange illness, the belief that electricity hurt his body, and he was terrified that Rebecca would find out and think he was crazy. During the dinner, Rebecca's phone rang, and Chuck panicked at the sight of it and knocked it from her hands. It was an awful, embarrassing moment, and Jimmy was there. Jimmy smoothed it over. Jimmy covered for his brother, helped hide the secret, protected Chuck from the shame of being seen as broken. Back then, Jimmy was the keeper of Chuck's most painful secret. He guarded it like family is supposed to. Hold that memory, because it makes what comes next so much sharper. Chuck set a trap, and it was a good one. He knew Jimmy's softest spot was guilt and love, so he used both. Chuck pretended to fall apart. He acted like a man giving up on life, broken and hopeless, and he let Jimmy come to him in that state. Moved by guilt and by the old brotherly need to make Chuck feel better, Jimmy confessed. He admitted to the whole forgery, explained how he had swapped the numbers, told Chuck not to blame himself for the mistake at the bank, because it had never been Chuck's mistake at all. It was a tender, terrible thing, a younger brother trying to lift a weight off an older brother's shoulders. And the entire time, Chuck had a hidden recorder running, catching every word. Chuck now had Jimmy's confession on tape. He showed it to the head of his firm and began making plans to use it to end Jimmy's career for good. But the tape alone was a tricky weapon, and word of it reached Jimmy. So Jimmy did something rash and angry. He broke into Chuck's house and destroyed the recording, smashing it to pieces. He did this in front of a witness, Chuck's assistant, who was there the whole time. And that, it turned out, was the real prize Chuck had been fishing for. Now, Jimmy had broken into a home and destroyed evidence with someone watching. Chuck reported it, and he filed a formal complaint demanding that Jimmy be stripped of his license to practice law. This is what brought everyone into the room. A panel of 3 would decide whether Jimmy McGill got to remain a lawyer at all. Everything Jimmy had clawed his way toward, the years in the mailroom, the failed tests, the long climb, all of it could end in that single hearing. Kim stood beside him as his lawyer and his partner, and across the room sat Chuck, the respected elder brother, the brilliant attorney, ready to bury Jimmy under the weight of the truth. The hearing began the way Chuck wanted. The recording was played for the panel, Jimmy's own voice confessing to the forgery filling the room. It was damaging. It made Jimmy look exactly like what he was, a man who had cheated and then tried to destroy the proof. Chuck took the stand calm and confident, the picture of a reasonable man simply telling what he knew. He had the high ground, and he knew it. What Chuck did not know was that Jimmy and Kim had planned something for him, something quiet and devastating, built around the one weakness Chuck could never admit to. Chuck's whole defense of himself, his whole identity, rested on the idea that his illness was real and physical, that electricity truly hurt his body. He needed people to believe that, because if his illness was only in his mind, then he was not a wronged genius, but a sick and obsessed man. Jimmy understood this better than anyone alive, because Jimmy had spent years protecting that exact secret. So Jimmy arranged for a large, friendly man named Huel, a pickpocket he knew, to do one small thing. Before the hearing, Huel bumped into Chuck in a hallway, the kind of harmless bump that happens 100 times a day. And in that bump, Huel slipped a fully charged phone battery into the inside pocket of Chuck's jacket. Then everyone went into the room, and Chuck sat down to testify with a live, working battery resting against his chest, and he felt nothing. On the stand, Chuck spoke about his condition with total certainty. He explained how sensitive he was, how a charged device anywhere near him would cause him real pain, how he could always tell when electricity was present. He built the case for his own illness brick by brick, sure he was making himself look careful and credible. And then the trap closed. Jimmy and Kim revealed that Chuck had been sitting there for a long stretch of time with a charged battery in his own pocket, right against his body, and had not noticed a thing. The battery was produced. The math was simple and merciless. A man who claimed that electricity tortured him had carried a source of it next to his heart for over an hour and felt absolutely fine. The room shifted. The panel understood at once what it meant. Chuck's illness, the thing he had built his recent life around, the thing he insisted was physical and real, lived only in his mind. Everyone could see it now. And Chuck, who had walked in as the credible one, the sane one, the respected elder lawyer, felt the ground vanish beneath him, in front of the very people whose respect was the air he breathed. He came apart. Sitting on that stand, exposed and humiliated, Chuck stopped being careful. The calm, reasonable mask slid off and the obsession underneath came pouring out. He began to rant about Jimmy, his voice rising, the words tumbling out faster than he could stop them. He spoke of how Jimmy had been conning people since they were children, how Jimmy charmed everyone and got away with everything, how the whole world handed his little brother forgiveness he had never earned. He revealed the full depth of his hatred, the years of resentment, the bitterness he had hidden behind a lawyer's polish. The longer he spoke, the smaller he looked, until he was just a furious, frightened man, shouting about his brother in a room full of stunned faces. At some point, he seemed to hear himself, to feel the silence around him, to realize that everyone was staring, and that he had destroyed his own image with his own mouth. But by then, it was far too late. The panel did not throw Jimmy out of the law forever. They chose instead to suspend his license for 1 year, a punishment, but a survivable one. Jimmy had escaped the worst. He kept his future. He walked out of that room still able to call himself a lawyer one day soon. And Chuck walked out of that room finished, his reputation in ruins, his peers now seeing him as an unstable man eaten alive by a grudge against his own brother. The thing that makes this hour so hard to sit with is the weapon Jimmy chose. He did not beat Chuck with facts about the forgery, because the facts were against him. He won by exposing the secret he had once sworn, without words, to protect. The illness Jimmy had covered for at that dinner with Rebecca, the shame he had shielded his brother from years ago, became the very blade he drove into Chuck in public. The keeper of the secret turned into the man who broadcast it to the world. There is a special kind of betrayal in that. The betrayal of taking the soft, vulnerable thing a person showed you in trust and using it to take them apart in front of a crowd. And it worked because Jimmy was willing to do what a decent person would not. A decent person might have lost the hearing rather than humiliate a mentally ill brother before his peers. A decent person might have accepted the punishment as the price of the forgery. Jimmy looked at the choice between losing his career and destroying his brother. And he chose to destroy his brother, and he was good enough at it to win clean. Kim helped him do it, which means the rot was spreading to her too. The careful, honest lawyer now standing at Jimmy's side as the trap sprang shut. Jimmy did not celebrate. There was no joy in his face when it was over. None of the loose, alive happiness from his week with Marco. He looked hollow, like a man who had won something and felt sick about the price. Part of him still loved Chuck. Part of him knew exactly what he had just done. But knowing did not stop him, and that is the heart of the matter. By now, Jimmy could see the cruelty of his own actions clearly, and go through with them anyway. The voice that once made him give back a bag of stolen money, the voice that once made him cover for his sick brother out of love, had grown so faint that it could no longer change what his hands did. The slow fall had reached a new place. In one part of the story, Jimmy decided to stop fighting himself. In another, he swapped 2 numbers and did quiet damage with a feather touch. Now he had stood in a room full of people and methodically dismantled a human being, his own flesh and blood, and had done it with skill and nerve and a ready excuse. The corruption was no longer a private feeling or a hidden trick. It had become something he could perform out loud in the open against someone he loved and still walk away from on his own 2 feet. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Winning the war against Chuck did not bring Jimmy any peace, and it did not slow him down. The skills he had sharpened to a deadly edge in that courtroom did not go back in their box afterward. They stayed out, ready, looking for the next problem to solve. And the next time Jimmy reached for them, the target would not be a clever lawyer who had wronged the woman he loved. It would be a gentle, trusting old woman who had never done a single thing to hurt him. A woman who liked him and counted on him, and the reason he would turn his gift against her would be nothing grander than a pile of money he wanted sooner rather than later. Section 5. The Old Woman Who Trusted Him. By this point in the story, Jimmy McGill was broke and getting broker. The hearing that broke Chuck had cost Jimmy too. His license to practice law was suspended for a full year, which meant he was not allowed to work as a lawyer and could not earn the way he used to. The bills did not stop coming, though. There was the expensive office he shared with Kim, the costs of the little business he ran, filming cheap television commercials, and the simple daily weight of needing money to live. A man who has lost his income but kept his expenses is a man under quiet, grinding pressure, and that pressure shapes the choices he makes. There was one large pile of money waiting somewhere down the road, if only Jimmy could reach it. Years earlier, Jimmy had uncovered something rotten. A chain of homes for the elderly called Sandpiper Crossing had been cheating its old residents, charging them far too much for everyday things and quietly draining their savings. Jimmy found it, gathered the wronged old people together, and turned it into a huge lawsuit. The case grew so big that larger firms took over the heavy lifting, but Jimmy kept a share of whatever the case eventually won. If the lawsuit settled, meaning the company agreed to pay the old people, to make the case go away, Jimmy would collect his cut. That cut came to about $1,160,000. It was the kind of money that could end all his troubles in a single afternoon. The woman at the center of that lawsuit was named Irene Landry. Irene was the lead client, the one who stood for all the other elderly residents, the one whose choices moved the case forward. She was gentle and sweet and a little lonely, the way many older people are, and she adored Jimmy. To Irene and her friends, Jimmy was not a sleazy lawyer. He was a bright spot in their week, a charming younger man who paid attention to them, made them laugh, treated them like they still mattered. They trusted him completely. Irene, most of all. The company had finally offered a settlement, a sum of money to close the case. If the lawyers said yes, the old people would get paid, and Jimmy would get his $1,000,000. But the lawyers, led by Howard at Chuck's old firm, believed they could squeeze the company for more if they waited. So they advised Irene to hold out, to turn down the current offer, and gamble on a bigger one later. Irene, trusting her lawyers, refused the deal. That refusal locked Jimmy's money away, possibly for years. Jimmy tried the honest route first, more or less. He went to Howard and pushed him to take the settlement now. Howard refused, and worse, Howard saw straight through him. Howard understood that Jimmy was not worried about the old people. Jimmy wanted his cut, and he wanted it fast. With the honest door shut in his face, Jimmy turned to the only door he ever really trusted. And what he did next was the ugliest thing he had done up to that point in his life. He decided to make Irene want the settlement herself. And to do that, he poisoned her friendships. Irene's whole little world was her circle of friends, the other old women she walked with, exercised with, sat with, and gossiped with day after day. Those friendships were the warmth that filled her days. Jimmy understood that, and he used it. Slowly, carefully, he turned the group against her. He planted the idea among the other women that Irene was the reason none of them were getting their money. He made it seem like Irene was being selfish and stubborn, holding everyone's payout hostage out of greed or foolishness. He gave Irene small, friendly gifts, including a nice pair of shoes, and then made sure the other women noticed, so that envy and resentment could do their slow work. He staged little moments to be overheard, twisting the truth until the women saw their old friend as the villain keeping them from their reward. It worked perfectly, and it was awful to watch. The friends froze Irene out. They stopped saving her a seat. They stopped including her in their walks. They went cold and cruel in the small, sharp ways that hurt the most. And poor Irene had no idea why. She had done nothing. She did not understand what she had supposedly done wrong. She only knew that the people who had been her family for years suddenly could not stand to be near her, and the loneliness crushed her. She wandered through her days bewildered and heartbroken, an old woman who had lost everyone she loved over a lie she never even heard. Under the weight of that isolation, Irene broke down and changed her mind. To win back her friends, to stop being the hated one, she pushed to accept the settlement. After all, the case settled. The money was released. And just like that, Jimmy got his $1 million. He went back to the office to share the good news with Kim. The payout secured, the bills handled, the pressure gone. He had taken a kind, trusting, helpless old woman. A woman who liked him and depended on him, and he had quietly destroyed her happiness for money. There was no Chuck in this one to blame. Irene had never wronged him. She had never wronged anyone. She was simply standing between Jimmy and a pile of cash, and so Jimmy reached out with the same talent he had used on strangers in bars and on his own brother in a courtroom, and he flattened her life without raising his voice. This is the moment the corruption reached the truly innocent. Up to now, there had always been some story Jimmy could tell himself. He bent the rules because Chuck broke him. He forged the documents because Chuck stole Kim's client. He destroyed Chuck because his career was on the line. Each time there was a wrong to point at, a reason that took a little of the weight off. Irene gave him nothing to point at. The only reason was greed, plain and bare, and Jimmy did it anyway. The gift that began as a way to survive on the streets of Cicero had become a tool he would use on anyone who stood between him and what he wanted, no matter how gentle or how blameless they were. But here the story does something it will not do again for much longer. Jimmy could not live with it. He got his money, and the money did not sit right. He watched what he had done to Irene, the lonely figure she had become, frozen out and confused, and the picture would not leave him. The old part of Jimmy, the part Chuck once helped shape, the part that gave back a bag of stolen cash and covered for a sick brother out of love, that part stirred awake one last time and refused to be quiet. And so Jimmy did something that cost him dearly. He decided to fix it. He knew the old women liked to listen at the door whenever he gave one of his talks. So he used that. He arranged to be overheard saying the truth out loud that he, Jimmy, was the one who had turned them all against Irene, that he had manipulated them on purpose, and that Irene's was completely innocent and had done nothing but care about them the whole time. He made himself the villain of the story openly, where they could all hear it. The women, ashamed of how they had treated their friend, welcomed Irene back into the fold. Her world was restored. Her friendships came home to her, and it cost Jimmy real money and real standing. By confessing to being the manipulator, he burned his good name with the entire elderly community, the same community that fed his commercial business and his future as an elder law attorney. Those clients would never trust him again. He threw away a steady stream of income and goodwill to undo the harm he had done to one old woman, a woman who would never even know what he had sacrificed for her. He fixed it quietly, took the loss, and told almost no one. That choice matters more than almost anything else in this part of his story, because it is the last time the old Jimmy clearly wins. For one more moment, the guilt was stronger than the greed. The conscience still had teeth. Jimmy could do a terrible thing, but he could not yet leave it done. Some part of him still needed to be the kind of man who makes it right, even at a cost to himself, even when no one is watching. The reason that conscience still worked is worth sitting with. The voice inside Jimmy that made him save Irene was, in a strange way, a gift from Chuck. It came from the years when Jimmy looked up to his brother and tried to be worthy of him, when being good meant something, because Chuck might see it and be proud. That break on his worst urges had its roots in the bond between the brothers, in the same soil where all the love and all the pain grew. As long as that bond meant anything to Jimmy, the break still held, even after everything. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously, which is what makes the days that followed so devastating. In the very same stretch of time that Jimmy was quietly sacrificing his reputation to save a lonely old woman, he made one last attempt to mend things with the brother he had broken. He went to Chuck, humbled and softened, ready to admit he could have done things differently. And Chuck, cold and certain, would answer him with 7 small words that cut the final thread between them. Then, that very night, Chuck would do a thing that took all of Jimmy's guilt and grief and crushed it into something far heavier, something that would never lift and that no good deed could ever undo. Section 6. The last words. For a little while, it looked like Chuck might find his way back. After the courtroom afternoon that tore his reputation to shreds, Chuck did something brave and surprising. He decided to fight his illness instead of hiding from it. He began working with a doctor. He started forcing himself to be around the electricity he had feared for so long, a little at a time, trying to prove to his own mind that it could not hurt him. And it seemed to be working. He turned his lights back on. He sat in rooms he once would have fled. For the first time in years, Chuck looked like a man climbing out of a deep hole, reaching for a normal life again. But the world he was climbing back toward had already decided it was done with him. The firm that carried his name, the firm he had helped build from nothing, no longer wanted him. His meltdown on the witness stand had been seen by everyone who mattered, and it had left the firm exposed and expensive to protect. So the partners moved to push him out. Howard, the man who had once looked up to Chuck like a mentor, was the one who delivered the blow. To save the firm, Howard paid Chuck to leave it, buying out his share and showing him the door of the company that bore his own last name. For a man like Chuck, whose entire sense of who he was lived, inside that firm and that law, losing it was like losing a limb. He had spent his whole life proving he was the serious one, the respected one, the McGill who mattered, and now he had been quietly walked out of his own legacy. Across town, something happened that pulled Jimmy in a softer direction. Kim, his partner and the person he loved most, had been pushing herself far too hard, working endless hours, barely sleeping. One day, driving alone, she fell asleep at the wheel and crashed her car. She survived, but she was hurt, her arm broken, her face bruised, the kind of accident that could so easily have killed her. Jimmy nearly lost her, and the shock of almost losing Kim did something to him. It made him think about how short life is, how fast the people you love can be taken away, how much time gets wasted on grudges. It made him think about his brother. So Jimmy went to Chuck. He went humble, with his guard down, ready to try to mend the broken thing between them. He told Chuck that something had happened that made him think about everything that had gone wrong between the two of them. He said that, looking back, he could have made different choices. It was as close to an apology as a man like Jimmy could get. An honest reaching out, a younger brother trying to find his way back to the older one before it was too late. Chuck would not take his hand. He sat there calm and cold and told Jimmy not to worry himself. He said they did not need to make up. He said they did not need to understand each other. He said things were fine exactly the way they were. And then he said the thing that would follow Jimmy for the rest of his life. He told Jimmy that he did not want to hurt his feelings, but that the truth was Jimmy had never mattered all that much to him. He went further. He told Jimmy that this was simply who Jimmy was, that in the end, he would only hurt everyone around him, that there was no point pretending otherwise. Jimmy stood frozen. The hurt was too big to even speak through. He had come to offer his heart, and his brother had handed it back to him in pieces. After a long, awful moment, he turned and walked slowly out of the house. Chuck did not watch him go. Chuck turned his back, sat down at his desk, and went back to his work, glancing over his shoulder only once to make sure his brother had really left. That was the last time the two of them ever spoke. The line Chuck said is one of the cruelest things one person can say to another, and the show is careful to leave its true meaning open. Some who watch it believe Chuck meant every word, that he had simply run out of patience and love. Others believe Chuck was lying on purpose, saying the most wounding thing he could think of in order to drive Jimmy away for good, to cut his little brother loose so that Jimmy would stop circling back to a relationship that only ever hurt them both. Maybe Chuck thought he was setting Jimmy free. Maybe he was just being honest and cold. The terrible part is that no one will ever know for sure, least of all Jimmy. And that not knowing is its own kind of wound, the kind that never closes because it can never be answered. What happened next happened alone, with no one there to see it but the audience. After Jimmy left, Chuck's brief recovery cracked and gave way. The progress he had fought so hard for collapsed under the weight of everything. The lost firm, the lost respect, the lost brother. That night, alone in his big dark house, Chuck slid all the way back into his illness, worse than ever before. He got up in the dark and shut off all the power to the house, flipping every switch, killing every circuit. Then he looked outside at the electricity meter, the little device on the wall that measures power flowing into a home. To his eyes, it was still moving, still spinning, still counting electricity that should not have been there. The sight of it set something off in him. He called the power company to complain. He went through the house and unscrewed every single light bulb, one by one. And still, in his mind, the meter kept turning. What followed was slow and hard to watch. A brilliant man unraveling completely in real time. Chuck began to tear his own home apart, in search of the electricity he was sure was hidden inside it. He took a tool to the walls and ripped them open, pulling out wires by the fistful. He tore up the floor. He dragged every electrical thing he owned out into the yard, of emptying the house of anything that could carry a current. And when none of it stopped the meter from turning in his mind, he picked up a baseball bat and beat the meter off the wall until it finally went still. The show quietly reveals that the wires feeding the meter had already been cut, which means the spinning Chuck saw, the spinning that drove him to destroy his home, was happening only inside his own head. He was chasing something that was not there. When it was over, Chuck sat alone in the wreckage. The walls were torn open. The house was dark and stripped bare. He wrapped himself once more in the shiny blanket he used to block out the world, the symbol of the illness he had tried so hard to beat and had now fully surrendered to. In front of him, on his desk, sat a single gas lantern, its small flame the only light left in the ruined house. For a long, still moment, Chuck simply sat there, and then he kicked the desk, knocking the lantern to the floor. The flame caught, the fire began to spread, and Chuck made no move to stop it, no move to escape. The last image is the lantern tipping, the fire rising, and a man who had run out of reasons to keep running. The show never says the word out loud. It never has a character stand up and announce what happened. It shows the lantern, the fire, the stillness, and then it lets the screen go dark, and it trusts everyone watching to understand. Chuck took his own life in the burning of his home, a quiet, devastating end to one of the most carefully drawn characters the show ever built. It is filmed with almost no music, no dramatic speeches, just the long, patient, unbearable sight of a proud man coming apart and then choosing the dark. Many who have watched the whole series point to this as the most haunting ending of any chapter. The moment the show changed forever, the loss it could never quite recover from. Jimmy was not there. He did not see it. He did not know. He would only learn of the fire and his brother's death later, when the smoke had cleared and the worst was already done. He had no chance to stop it, no warning, no last conversation beyond the cold one in the living room. He went to bed that night, a man who had tried to apologize and been turned away, and he woke up, eventually, into a world where his brother was gone, and the final words between them had been words of rejection. This is the wound that does not heal, and it is different from every wound that came before it. The harm Jimmy did to Irene could be undone, and Jimmy undid it, sacrificing his own reputation to give a lonely old woman her friends back. That was a thing he could fix. Chuck's death was a thing no one could ever fix. There would be no making it right, no clever plan, no good deed large enough to balance the scale. The last time the brothers spoke, Jimmy reached out, and Chuck refused him. And now Chuck was ash, and that exchange would stand forever as the final chapter of their whole shared life. Jimmy would carry the question for the rest of his days. Did he kill his brother? Did breaking Chuck in that courtroom set the fire? Did the cold rejection in the living room push Chuck the last step toward the lantern? The show does not give a clean answer, and so Jimmy never gets one either. He gets only the weight, and here is where the slow fall of Jimmy McGill turns onto its darkest road. Way back at the beginning, the thing that held Jimmy to the honest path was his bond with Chuck. He was good because he wanted Chuck to be proud, because he wanted to be worthy of the brother he looked up to. Even after the betrayals, even after the forgery and the courtroom, some thread of that bond survived, and that thread was the break on his worst self. It was the reason he gave back the stolen money. It was the reason he covered for Chuck out of love. It was the reason, just days earlier, that he threw away his good name to save Irene. The conscience that kept pulling Jimmy back from the edge had its roots in his brother. Now the brother was gone. Worse than gone. He was gone in a way that left Jimmy soaked in guilt and unable to ever ask forgiveness or hear it given. The thread snapped. The brake that had slowed his fall for so long was suddenly attached to nothing. Whatever was holding Jimmy back had been tied, at the deepest level, to a man who was now dead, and dead believing his little brother never mattered. A person can survive grief and come out softer, gentler, more careful with the people who remain. A person can also lock the grief away in a place so deep and so cold that they stop feeling much of anything at all. The fire in Chuck's house did not just kill a man. It burned away the last reason Jimmy McGill had to keep trying to be good. In the long, gray months that followed, Jimmy did not fall apart the way people expected him to. He did something stranger and more frightening. He took the unbearable weight of his brother's death, and he buried it somewhere so far down that it stopped showing on his face. He kept moving. He kept hustling. He went numb in a way that looked almost like strength. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. And the next time he found himself standing in front of a panel of people who held his entire future in their hands, the same kind of panel that had suspended his license, he would do something that revealed exactly how much of the old Jimmy had died in that fire alongside Chuck. He would stand before them and weep about his lost brother, pouring out love and grief and respect until the whole room was moved. And the second the door closed behind him, he would turn to Kim with a grin and reveal that he had not meant a single word of it, that he had used his dead brother's memory as a tool, and that the man who walked out of that building would carry a brand new name. Section 7. The new name everyone who knew Jimmy waited for him to break after Chuck died, and the breaking never came. That was the first sign that something inside him had changed for good. A man loses his only brother, loses him to fire, loses him with cruel words still hanging in the air between them, and the people around that man braced themselves for the collapse. Kim braced for it, but Jimmy did not collapse. He got up. He made coffee. He went about his days with an unsettling steadiness, talking about ordinary things, handling ordinary tasks, acting for all the world like a man whose brother had not just burned to death, carrying a grudge against him. The grief was in there somewhere. It had to be. But Jimmy had pushed it down into a place so deep and so locked that it stopped reaching his face. And a person who can do that to the worst pain of their life can do almost anything. The clearest, coldest proof of the new Jimmy came in a quiet conversation with Howard. Howard was falling apart over Chuck's death. He had been the one who pushed Chuck out of the firm, and he was sure that decision had helped send Chuck toward the fire. The guilt was eating Howard alive. He could not sleep. He could not let it go. So Howard came to Jimmy and opened up, confessing his fear that he had caused Chuck's death, laying his guilt bare to the only other person who had loved Chuck. It was the kind of moment where one grieving man reaches out to another, hoping to share a weight too heavy to carry alone. Jimmy looked at this broken, guilt-sick man, and he did something chilling. He agreed with him. He told Howard that yes, this was Howard's burden to carry, his alone, and then he got up and walked out, leaving Howard sitting there, stunned and devastated. And as Jimmy left, he looked lighter than he had in months, almost cheerful. The reason was simple and ugly. Jimmy was drowning in his own guilt over Chuck, and here was a chance to hand the whole weight of it to someone else. By letting Howard believe it was all Howard's fault, Jimmy got to set his own guilt down. He walked away free, and he left a good man to suffer for a death they had both played a part in. The old Jimmy could never have done that. The old Jimmy gave back stolen money and saved lonely old women. This new, hollowed-out Jimmy traded another man's peace of mind for his own and barely blinked. While all this was happening, Jimmy still could not work as a lawyer. His license was suspended, and the year was dragging on. He needed money, so he took a job selling cell phones in a small store. But selling phones honestly bored him, and Jimmy was never one to do anything the boring way. He figured out that there were people who wanted phones that could not be traced, cheap phones they could use once and throw away, the kind of phones that criminals love. So Jimmy started seeking those customers out. He stood on corners and made his pitch to shady men, selling them privacy, selling them a way to do their crimes without being caught. Bit by bit, without quite deciding to, Jimmy drifted toward the criminal world. He was becoming known among the wrong sort of people as a guy who could help, a guy who did not ask questions, a guy on their side. The honest path was behind him, and a darker one was opening up ahead. There was one more thing Chuck left behind, and it would become the most important prop in the whole story. Sometime before the war between them, back when things were better, Chuck had written Jimmy a letter. It was a warm, loving letter, full of pride and brotherly affection, the kind of tender words Chuck could never quite manage to say to Jimmy's face. After Chuck died, that letter found its way to Jimmy. Here was the one piece of solid proof that Chuck had loved him, written in Chuck's own hand. And Jimmy read it and felt almost nothing. He was cold about it. He suspected the letter did not mean what it said, or he simply could not let himself believe it. Kim was moved to tears by it. Jimmy folded it up and put it away, unmoved, a man too numb to be reached even by his dead brother's kindness. When the year of suspension finally ended, Jimmy applied to get his law license back. To do this, he had to stand before a small board, the people who would decide whether he could be a lawyer again. The first time he stood before them, he gave a smooth, confident speech. He said all the right words about respecting the law and learning his lesson, and the board turned him down. They could feel that he did not mean any of it. The words were polished and empty. The law, just a job he wanted back, and they could see right through him. He had not said one word about his brother, the famous lawyer who had just died, and his silence on that made his speech ring false. The board sent him away. Jimmy and Kim understood the problem. To win the board over, Jimmy could not just say the right things. He had to make them feel something. He had to show them a real beating heart, a man genuinely connected to the law and genuinely changed. And Jimmy knew exactly where to find the emotion that would do the trick. He would use Chuck. The second time he stood before the board, Jimmy gave the performance of his life. He spoke about his brother. He talked about Chuck, the great lawyer. Chuck, who had given his whole life to the law. Chuck, whose name and legacy Jimmy claimed he wanted desperately to honor. He pulled out the loving letter Chuck had written him and spoke about it, about what it meant, about the bond between them. His voice cracked, his eyes filled with tears. He stood there and wept about his lost brother in front of the board, pouring out grief and love and respect until the whole room was moved by the sight of it. He looked like a man finally breaking open, finally letting the pain of his brother's death pour out, finally becoming the serious and feeling person the board needed to see. It worked. The board was moved. They voted to give Jimmy his license back. He had won. Kim was in the room, and Kim was crying too. She had watched the man she loved finally seem to grieve, finally honor Chuck, finally show the heart she always believed was in there. To Kim, this was a breakthrough. The moment Jimmy let himself feel the loss he had been burying for months. She walked out of that building beside him, with her own eyes wet, full of relief and tenderness, certain that something real and good had just happened. And out in the hallway, the second they were clear of the board, Jimmy turned to her with a wide grin and let the whole thing drop. The tears, the cracking voice, the grief, the love for Chuck, all of it had been an act, a performance, a con. He said one word to Kim that revealed the truth of what she had just witnessed. He called the board members suckers, delighted with himself, thrilled that the trick had landed so perfectly. He had not meant a single thing he said in that room. He had taken his dead brother's memory, the letter written in love, the grief that should have been the most private and sacred thing he owned, and he had turned all of it into a tool to fool a panel of strangers. Kim watched the mask come off, and the look on her face was the look of someone watching a person they love disappear in front of them, because that is what was happening. The grief she had been so moved by was not real. The man who could fake his own brother's death grief for a small advantage was not the Jimmy she had fallen for. Something had gone out of him in the fire, and she was only now seeing how completely it was gone. The final blow came moments later. Riding high on his win, Jimmy went to file the paperwork that would put him back to work as a lawyer, and he told the clerk that he would not be practicing under the name Jimmy McGill. He had a new name now. From this day forward, he would practice law as Saul Goodman. The name was an old joke of his, one he had been using on the side while selling phones and making commercials. Saul Goodman. Say it out loud, and it sounds like the phrase a smooth, cheerful huckster would use to wave away any problem. The words Saul Goodman run together into a single bright, breezy name. It was the name of a salesman, a fast talker, a man with no past and no family, and nothing weighing him down. And Jimmy chose it on purpose in that moment, with his brother barely cold in the ground. The choosing of that name is the true center of his fall, the thing this whole story has been building toward. A name is not a small thing. The name McGill connected Jimmy to Chuck, to his family, to the brother he had loved and broken and lost. It connected him to the boy who wanted to be worthy, to the man who worked in the mailroom and studied at night and wept with relief when he finally passed the bar. The name McGill carried the guilt of Chuck's death, but it also carried everything good Jimmy had ever tried to be. To keep that name was to keep the wound and to keep the hope tied to it. By shedding it, by becoming Saul Goodman, Jimmy was trying to walk away from all of it at once, the guilt and the grief and the dead brother and the disappointing, struggling, decent man he used to be. Saul Goodman had no brother to mourn. Saul Goodman owed nothing to anyone. Saul Goodman could do whatever he wanted because there was no McGill family name left to drag through the mud. No Chuck looking down to be disappointed. No legacy to protect. Look at how far the road has run from where it started. In the beginning, Jimmy was good for a reason, and the reason was his brother. He worked himself to the bone trying to earn Chuck's respect. The whole slow fall began the afternoon. Chuck told him that respect would never come, that slippin' Jimmy with a law degree was a danger to everyone. From there, each step took Jimmy a little further. He chose to stop fighting his nature. He aimed his tricks at his brother and did quiet harm. He destroyed Chuck in a courtroom using a secret he had once protected. He flattened a trusting old woman for money, then sacrificed his good name to save her in the last clear victory his conscience ever won. Then Chuck died, alone and bitter, and burned away the last reason Jimmy had to hold himself back. And now, standing in front of a clerk, Jimmy formally set down the name of the brother he had lost and picked up the name of a man who could feel nothing, owe nothing, and fear nothing. Jimmy McGill did not die in that fire with Chuck. He did something almost sadder. He chose to bury himself and walk out wearing someone new, someone built to never hurt the way Jimmy hurt, someone designed from the ground up to slip free of every weight a normal person carries. Kim saw it happen. She stood in that hallway and watched the man she loved trade his own soul for a lighter one. and she did not yet understand how far down the new man would be willing to go. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Saul Goodman thought he had reached the bottom of his fall, that taking the new name was the end of the change. He was wrong. The small-time criminals he had been selling phones to were the shallow end of a very deep and very dangerous pool, and that pool had noticed him. Soon a man would step into Saul's life who was as charming as Saul himself and 100 times more deadly. A smiling killer who would look at this slick new lawyer and see exactly the right tool for a dangerous job. And one day, that man would send Saul Goodman out alone into the empty desert to carry $7 million in cash across miles of nothing, with the lives of strangers riding on whether he made it back. And Saul, who once gave away a fortune just to do the right thing, would say yes without thinking twice. Section 8. Into the desert Saul Goodman went looking for the kind of clients Jimmy McGill once would have crossed the street to avoid. The new name came with a new kind of business, and Saul leaned all the way into it. He advertised himself to the criminals of the city as the lawyer who understood them, the one who would not judge, the one who knew every trick and loophole and would happily use them. He handed out cards on street corners. He ran cheap promotions, offering criminals discounts on his services like a store running a holiday sale. Word spread fast in that world, the way it always does, and soon Saul had a steady stream of drug dealers, thieves, and lowlifes filling his waiting room. This was the practice he had built. Jimmy McGill had dreamed of respectable white-collar law. Saul Goodman made his living defending the worst people he could find. That work pulled him steadily downward, deeper than the small-time crooks he started with. Through old connections from his phone-selling days, Saul had brushed up against the edges of the drug cartel that ran much of the city's underworld, a violent organization built on fear and money and death. For a while he stayed on the outer edges of it, taking their money, doing their small legal chores, keeping a careful distance from the real darkness at the center. But a man who keeps drifting toward danger eventually arrives at it, and Saul's arrival came in the shape of a smiling man named Lalo. Lalo Salamanca was the most dangerous kind of person, because he did not look dangerous at all. He was warm and funny and charming, a man who laughed easily and made you feel like his oldest friend within minutes of meeting him. He cooked for people. He joked with them. He had a bright, friendly face that put everyone at ease. And underneath all that charm sat a cold, patient killer, a man who could chat with you about your family 1 minute and order your death the next without his smile ever slipping. Lalo had come to run the cartel's business in town, and he was very, very good at it. Of everyone in that violent world, Lalo was perhaps the most frightening, precisely because the danger was so well hidden behind the warmth. Lalo got himself arrested for murder. He had a man killed during one of his operations, and the law caught up with him for it. Sitting in jail, Lalo needed a lawyer, and the lawyer the cartel sent for was Saul Goodman, the slick attorney who had been doing their small jobs. Saul took the case. Working with information quietly passed to him, he managed to argue Lalo's way into being released on bail while he awaited trial. The judge set that bail at a staggering amount, $7 million in cash. If the cartel could deliver $7 million to the court, Lalo would walk free until his trial. The cartel had the money, but it was sitting far away, across the border, in the middle of nowhere. Someone had to go and get it, drive out to a lonely spot in the empty desert, collect $7 million in cash, and bring it back. And Lalo decided that the someone should be Saul. A lawyer carrying a bag would draw no suspicion. Saul was now their guy, trusted and connected and useful. Lalo offered him $100,000 to make the trip, a fortune for what sounded like a simple drive. Kim begged him not to do it. She understood, even if Saul pretended not to, exactly how dangerous this was. She reminded him that he was an attorney, a man of the law, and not some courier hauling money for drug dealers across a desert. She could see the cliff he was about to step off, but Saul waved her worry away. He told her it would be easy. A quick drive out, a quick pickup, a quick drive back, $100,000 in his pocket by sundown. Nobody would suspect a lawyer. Nothing could go wrong. The man who years earlier had handed back $1.5 million in stolen money simply because it was the right thing to do, now agreed to carry $7 million of cartel cash through the desert because the fee was good and the job sounded simple. Kim's warning bounced right off him the way every warning had bounced off him since the fire that took his brother. He went. The drive out was quiet and lonely, mile after mile of empty land under a huge sky. Saul reached the pickup spot, a patch of nothing in the middle of nowhere, and the cartel's delivery arrived in the form of two of the most terrifying men in that whole terrifying world. They were twin brothers, silent and cold-eyed, killers so calm and so practiced that their stillness was scarier than any shouting. They handed over two heavy duffel bags stuffed with the $7 million. Then they were gone, and Saul was alone again with the bags, turning his car back toward home, probably already counting his $100,000 in his head. He did not get far before the simple job fell apart completely. Out on an empty stretch of road, several vehicles roared up and cut him off, boxing him in. Armed men jumped out, men who had somehow learned about the money and come to take it. They grabbed the duffel bags out of Saul's car. And then, with the casual cruelty of people who kill for a living, they moved to kill him too. There was no reason to leave a witness alive. Saul, who had talked his way out of 1,000 jams in his life, found himself in a place where talking would not help, kneeling in the dirt of a desert road with guns pointed at him and no clever words left. What saved him was a sound from far away. Without warning, the gunmen began to drop, picked off one after another by an unseen shooter firing from somewhere in the distance. It was sudden and shocking and merciless. Bullets found the men where they stood, and they fell, and their vehicles were shot full of holes until they could no longer run. Within moments, nearly all of them were dead, sprawled across the road, and only one managed to scramble into the single working vehicle and escape, fleeing into the desert. The hidden shooter was Mike, the quiet, hard man Saul had known for years, the former cop who now did dangerous work for powerful and dangerous people. Mike had been secretly following Saul the entire time, sent to watch over the money and the man carrying it, for reasons tangled up in the cartel's own deadly games. Mike had just killed several men to keep Saul alive, but the shootout had a cost. In all the gunfire, Mike's own truck had been hit and ruined, just like every other vehicle on that road. Saul's car was shot to pieces too, and so the two men found themselves stranded in the open desert, far from any town, far from any help, with two heavy bags holding $7 million and not a single working vehicle between them. The only way out was to walk, so they walked. And the long walk through that desert became the real test, the thing that nearly killed Saul Goodman and changed whatever was left of him for good. The desert is a furnace by day, with a sun that hammers down and a heat that pulls the water out of a body hour by hour. The two men set off across the cracked ground, carrying the impossibly heavy bags of cash, with almost no water between them and miles of nothing in every direction. Mike was hardened to this kind of suffering. He had been a soldier and a cop and a killer, and he knew how to ration water, how to pace himself, how to keep moving when his body screamed to stop. Saul knew none of it. He was a soft city man in a ruined suit and dress shoes, blistering and burning and falling apart, completely out of his depth. The hours stretched on, and the desert ground Saul down. His feet bled, his skin burned, his mouth turned to dust. They sipped tiny amounts of water, making it last, watching the level drop. At one point, a precious container of water was lost, leaking away into the thirsty ground. A small disaster in a place where water was the only thing standing between them and death. Saul, exhausted past anything he had ever known, came close to simply giving up. He wanted to lie down in the dirt and stop. Mike would not let him. The older man pushed him, drove him, refused to let Saul quit, dragging the two of them forward step by brutal step across the endless sand. When the sun went down, the cold came, because the desert that roasts you by day freezes you by night. Saul wrapped himself in a thin, shiny emergency blanket to hold in what little warmth his body had left, a flimsy silver sheet, much like the one his dead brother used to wrap himself in to hide from the world. The man who had taken a new name to escape, Chuck, now huddled under the same kind of shiny skin Chuck had clung to, shivering in the dark, far from everything, deep in a world of death that Jimmy McGill never could have imagined entering. And the danger was not over, because the one gunman who escaped came back. Somewhere out in that dark, the survivor returned, hunting the two men and the $7 million they carried. There was a long, tense stretch of cat and mouse in the desert night. The hunter searching, the two exhausted men trying to stay hidden and stay alive. Mike, sick and weakened from the heat and the lack of water, was not at full strength. Saul, terrified and worn down to almost nothing, had to find some last reserve of nerve to help survive the threat. In the end, the hunter was dealt with, the last loose end of the ambush closed, and the two men lived. They survived the road, the heat, the cold, the killers, and the long, impossible walk. Saul Goodman crawled out of that desert alive, but a piece of him had been left behind in the sand. This is one of the most praised chapters in the whole story, and it earns that praise by being slow, quiet, and merciless. There is almost no clever talk, almost none of the fast-paced wordplay that made Saul who he was. There is just the vast empty land, the punishing sun, the two small figures struggling across it, and the heavy bags of money that started it all. The camera holds on the emptiness. The silence is enormous, and in the middle of it stands Saul Goodman. In his wrecked suit, the slick city lawyer reduced to a sunburned, staggering animal fighting to take one more step. The world he chose to enter, with its money and its danger and its excitement, turned out to be a place that did not care how clever he was. A place that nearly cooked him into the dirt without a second thought. What makes this matter so much for the long story of Jimmy's fall is the line it crosses. Up to this point, every terrible thing Jimmy and then Saul had done was bloodless. He forged documents, he told lies, he ran cons. He destroyed his brother with a clever courtroom trick and broke an old woman's heart with whispered gossip. All of it was cruel, but none of it was violent. None of it had bodies. The desert changed that forever. Now, Saul was kneeling in the dirt with guns at his head, watching men die around him in the dust, carrying millions in cash for a smiling murderer, his survival bought with the lives of strangers Mike gunned down to save him. The world of paperwork and tricks was behind him. He had stepped fully into the world of guns and death. And he had stepped into it on purpose, for money and for the thrill of it, against the direct pleading of the woman who loved him. The contrast with who he used to be could not be sharper. The young man who gave back $1.5 million because keeping it would have been wrong was the same man who now hauled $7 million of blood money across a desert and counted his cut. The difference between those two men is the whole distance of his fall, measured out in a single bag of cash, and the desert stripped away whatever softness had survived the fire. A man who has knelt in the dirt waiting to be shot, who has walked through hell and watched people die and lived only by dumb luck and another man's bullets, does not come back the same. Saul came back harder, more numb, more deeply sunk into a life that had no exit. He had also learned something humbling and frightening, which was that in this new world he was not the smartest man in the room. He was small. He was prey. He had survived not because he was clever, but because Mike happened to be watching. The con man who always had an angle had finally found a place where his angles meant nothing, and he kept walking into it anyway. Kim had seen it coming. She had stood in their apartment and begged him not to go, and she had been completely right, and he had gone anyway. That was the pattern of everything now. Since the fire, every voice that tried to slow Saul down had been ignored. Every warning waved away, every break long since cut. The desert was simply the largest and most dangerous proof yet that the man who took a new name to feel nothing would walk straight into death rather than listen to anyone who loved him. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The strangest part was what the desert did to Kim. Instead of pulling her away from the danger, it seemed to draw her toward it, and soon the careful, honest woman who once begged Jimmy not to go would be the one dreaming up the cruelest plan of all a patient scheme to destroy a decent man named Howard. They would build it together with something close to joy, never guessing it would end with a body on their living room floor and a smiling killer standing over it. Section 9. The good man on the floor, Howard Hamlin, was not a bad man. That fact sits at the center of everything that goes wrong here, and it is the reason this part of the story is so much darker than anything before it. Howard could be smug. He had a big white smile and a fancy car, and an easy confidence that came from a life of money and success. And over the years he had looked down on Jimmy more than once, treating him like a lesser man, a clown, an embarrassment. He was not always kind, but he was, underneath the polish, a decent person. He ran his law firm honestly. He cared about doing good work. He had never done anything to truly deserve what was coming. Of all the people Jimmy and Kim could have chosen to destroy, Howard was perhaps the least deserving of it, and they chose him anyway. The reason, on the surface, was money. There was still that large pile of cash tied up in the old sandpiper case. The lawsuit about the cheated elderly residents. The same case that had once driven Jimmy to break poor Irene's heart. Years had passed, and the case still had not paid out. Howard, who now ran the firm handling it, was holding out for a bigger settlement, refusing to take the deal on the table, betting that patience would mean more money down the road. And while he waited, Jimmy's huge cut sat locked away out of reach. If the case settled now, Jimmy would finally collect. So the goal was simple: force the case to settle, and to do that, ruin Howard. But money was only part of it, and maybe not even the biggest part. Something had shifted in Kim, the careful, honest, hard-working woman who once begged Jimmy not to carry money for drug dealers. Had been changing for a long time, pulled bit by bit toward the thrill of the con, the rush of the scheme, the dark joy of pulling something off. And in this scheme, it was Kim who took the lead. It was Kim who pushed it forward. Kim who sharpened the plan. Kim who wanted it. The two of them grew closer than ever as they built it, almost giddy together, more alive in each other's company than they had been in ages. They were two people in love, bonded by the cruelest thing they had ever done, and the love and the cruelty had grown tangled up into the same feeling. That is its own kind of horror, two people finding their greatest closeness in the careful destruction of an innocent man. The plan they built was patient and elaborate and genuinely brilliant, which only makes it worse. Over many weeks, they set out to convince the world that Howard Hamlin was secretly a cocaine addict, a man losing his grip, unstable and unfit to be trusted with anything important. They worked at it from every angle. They planted small clues. They staged little scenes for people to stumble onto. They hired actors to play parts in their show, faking moments and faking photographs, building a false picture of Howard, piece by piece until it looked solid and real. Every step was designed to chip away at the one thing a respected lawyer cannot afford to lose, the belief of others that he is sound and sane and reliable. The plan came to its peak at an important meeting. A mediation where a retired judge would oversee talks, meant to finally settle the Sandpiper case. This was the room where the money would be decided, and Jimmy and Kim arranged for Howard to walk into that room looking like a man high on drugs. Through one of Jimmy's old shady contacts, they got hold of a chemical, and they put it on photographs they made sure Howard would handle. When Howard touched the photos and then touched his face and eyes, the chemical did its quiet work. His pupils blew wide, his heart raced. He grew flushed and strange and jittery. By the time he stood up in that crucial meeting, Howard looked, to everyone watching, exactly like a man who had just done a line of cocaine. And then the trap closed in the cruelest possible way, because Howard was right, and it did not matter. Howard had begun to figure out that Jimmy and Kim were conspiring against him. So in that meeting, looking wild-eyed and sweating and racing, he tried to tell everyone the truth. He accused Jimmy and Kim of an elaborate plot to destroy him. Every word of it was accurate. They really had spent weeks scheming against him. But because he looked like a drugged-up madman raving about a conspiracy, no one believed a single thing he said. The retired judge, the other lawyers, the people from the lawsuit, they all looked at this sweating, dilated, ranting man and saw a respected attorney having a public breakdown, a secret addict finally cracking apart, his credibility shattered in front of everyone who mattered. The case would now settle, the money would flow, and Howard's good name was destroyed. Jimmy and Kim were not even in the room. They listened in from somewhere else, following along as their plan played out perfectly, hearing Howard ruin himself with words that were completely true. And when it was done, when the trap had snapped exactly as designed, the two of them were thrilled. They were giddy with it, closer and more alive than ever. Two people who had just pulled off something monstrous and felt nothing but the warm glow of a job well done. They had taken a real human being, a decent if irritating man, and they had carefully, lovingly, painted him as a drug addict in front of his whole professional world, and they were delighted. That night, Howard came to find them. He had pieced it all together. He understood now, with terrible clarity, exactly what had been done to him and who had done it. So he drove to their apartment and he confronted them. He did not come with violence. He came with words, He stood in their living room and told them the truth about themselves, calmly and devastatingly. He laid out what they had done, the months of scheming, the cruelty of it, the sheer ugliness of destroying a man's reputation and career over money. He told them what kind of people they really were. He told them they were rotten, that what they had done was monstrous and far out of proportion to anything he had ever done to them, that they were going to have to carry it for the rest of their lives. Howard, the wronged man, the innocent party, stood in their home and held up a mirror, and everything he said was right. And while Howard was speaking, the door opened and a smiling killer walked in. Lalo Salamanca was supposed to be dead. The cartel war had turned. An attempt had been made on his life, and the world believed he had been killed. But Lalo had survived, gone into hiding, and now come back for Jimmy and Kim as part of his own deadly games with the cartel. Howard had no idea who Lalo was. Howard had never had anything to do with drug lords or cartels or any of the violence Saul had waded into out in that desert. Howard was a lawyer who had come to scold the people who ruined him, standing in the wrong living room at the wrong moment. Lalo took one look at the situation, and then, with the calm of a man swatting a fly, he raised his gun and shot Howard in the head, killing him instantly, cutting him off in the middle of a sentence. Howard crumpled and fell, striking his head on the coffee table as he went down. A small, awful echo of the way Chuck had once fallen and hit his head on the floor of a copy shop. Now there was a good man dead on the living room floor, his blood spreading across the carpet, and a smiling murderer standing over him, and Jimmy and Kim frozen in horror at what their game had brought into their home. Howard died for nothing. He died because he was brave enough to confront the people who had wronged him, and because he happened to do it on the same night that a man Jimmy had been hiding from came calling. He had no part in the cartel, no part in the danger, no understanding of the world that killed him. He was simply standing there, telling the truth, when death walked through the door on someone else's errand. The horror of it is total. The careful, clever, bloodless world of cons and schemes that Jimmy and Kim lived in had finally crashed straight into the world of guns and death that Saul had stepped into out in the desert, and the two worlds met in their own living room, and an innocent man paid for it with his life. This chapter is often called the finest hour the whole story ever produced, and it earns that not through action, but through dread. The plan against Howard is built so slowly and so cleverly that watching it almost feels like admiring a beautiful machine, right up until the moment the machine produces a corpse. The violence, when it comes, is sudden and quiet and final, with no warning and no music to soften it. And then there is the silence afterward, the stunned, ringing silence of two people staring at the body of a man they ruined, killed by a danger they invited into their lives. The skill of the con and the weight of the consequence sit side by side, and the gap between them is the whole point. They were so proud of how clever they had been, and a man was dead on the floor. What makes Howard's death sit so heavily, even more than the death of Chuck, is how clean the line of cause runs through it. Chuck's death was tangled and ambiguous. Chuck took his own life, alone, in the grip of an illness, after a long chain of events that Jimmy only partly set in motion, and the show never lets anyone be sure exactly how much blame belongs where. Howard's death has none of that fog. Howard is alive and good and standing in their home, and he is dead because of a scheme they built, for money and for sport, killed by a man who came looking for them. They did not pull the trigger, but the trigger would never have been pulled in that room if they had not spent months destroying a good man. And inviting a killer into their lives. The man who took a new name so he would never have to feel guilt again now had an innocent man's blood soaking into his own carpet. And the cruelty did not even end with the killing. Howard could not simply be reported dead, because his death would lead to questions, and the questions would lead to Lalo and the cartel and the whole hidden world. So Howard's body had to disappear. With the help of Mike's people, Jimmy and Kim covered it up. They had Howard buried in secret, hidden away where no one would ever find him. And they let the world believe that Howard had simply suffered a breakdown and vanished, a troubled, drug-addicted man who walked away from his life. The false picture they had so carefully painted, the lie that Howard was a cocaine addict losing his mind, became his permanent legacy. His widow, his colleagues, everyone who had ever known him would remember Howard Hamlin as a disgraced addict who fell apart and disappeared. The lie outlived the man. They had not only taken his life through the chain of their choices, they had stolen his good name forever, made sure that the truth of who he was would die with him in an unmarked grave. There is almost no crueler thing one person can do to another. For Kim, this was the end of something. She had been the one who drove the scheme, the one who wanted it, the one who found her greatest joy in pulling it off. And now she had watched a good man die in front of her because of it, and had helped bury him, and had helped erase his name. The thrill curdled into horror. The closeness she and Jimmy had found in their cruelty turned to poison in her hands. Slowly, she came to understand a terrible thing about the two of them together, which was that apart they might each be all right, but together they brought out something in each other that got people killed. The realization would not let her go. The long fall of Jimmy McGill had now reached its lowest depth in terms of the harm it did to others. It began all those years ago, with a wound from a brother, a private pain that hurt no one. It grew into small tricks, then real fraud, then the public destruction of Chuck, then the breaking of a trusting old woman's heart, then a step into a world of guns and death in the desert. And now it had arrived at a murdered innocent on a living room floor, killed by the collision of every choice Jimmy and Kim had made since the fire took Chuck. Each step had been a little worse than the last. A little further from the man who once gave back a bag of money because keeping it would be wrong. The slope had been long and slow and almost gentle, one reasonable-seeming choice after another, and it had ended here in blood. Howard's death took the last good thing Saul Goodman had left, though it would take a little time for the full loss to land. Kim was the final anchor holding Saul to anything like a real life. The last person who connected him to love and to conscience and to the man he used to be. And the body on their floor broke something between them that could never be repaired. Soon Kim would understand that she could not stay, that staying meant becoming someone she could not bear to be, that the kindest and hardest thing she could do was walk away from the man she loved. And once she was gone, once the last anchor was cut, there would be nothing holding Saul Goodman to the earth at all. He would vanish completely into the slick, shameless lawyer for monsters that everyone had always feared he would become. The man who would one day stand beside the worst criminals alive and help them do their worst. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. He would run that race all the way to its end, until years later, hiding behind one more borrowed name in a quiet city, far from home, the entire long fall would finally catch up with him in a single room, where the man who had spent a lifetime running from who he was would have to stand up and say it out loud. one last time. Section 10. The name he took back. After they buried Howard and his good name along with him, Kim could not go on. The death she had helped cause, the lie she had helped tell, the grave she had helped dig, all of it pressed down on her until she understood a hard truth about herself and the man she loved. Apart, the two of them might each manage to be something close to all right. Together, they were poison. Together, they brought out the parts of each other that got good people killed. So Kim did the bravest and most painful thing she could think of. She left. She quit the law she had worked her whole life to practice. She divorced Jimmy and walked out of his life completely, choosing a small, plain, honest existence far away over one more day, beside the man who set her worst self loose. She did it to save herself, and maybe to save what little was left of him, by taking away the danger that the two of them became. Losing Kim cut the last rope. She had been the final thing tying Saul Goodman to love, to conscience, to any memory of the man who once tried to be good. With her gone, there was nothing left to hold him back from becoming, fully and finally, the man everyone had feared he would become, and so he did. Saul Goodman threw himself into the role completely. He became the loud, shameless billboard and television lawyer, the man with the over-the-top advertisements, and the cheap suits and the office decorated to look like the Constitution itself. He became the lawyer for the worst people in the city, the criminals and the drug dealers and the killers, the man who would help anyone do anything for the right fee. And in time, he became the lawyer for a high school chemistry teacher turned drug kingpin, a man named Walter White, helping him hide his money and clean up his messes and dodge the law as his empire of poison spread. This was the height of Saul Goodman, rich and busy and protected, surrounded by criminals, untouched by guilt, exactly the man he had built himself to be. When he shed his brother's name, and he was completely hollow. There was nothing inside the suit but the suit. When Walter White's empire finally collapsed in fire and blood, it took Saul Goodman down with it. The whole rotten world came apart, and Saul had to run for his life. He paid a man who made people disappear, and he vanished, given a brand new identity in a faraway place. He became Gene Takovich, the quiet manager of a Cinnabon bakery in a shopping mall in cold gray Omaha, a nobody in an apron selling cinnamon rolls to strangers. This was supposed to be safety. It was actually a kind of living death. Gene spent his days in fear, flinching at every face that lingered too long, every voice that sounded too curious, a ghost of a man hiding inside a stranger's life. He had taken a new name once to escape his guilt, and now he had taken yet another name to escape the law. And each new name had hollowed him out a little more, until there was almost nothing of any of them left. But even buried under the apron and the fake name, the old hunger would not die. Gene could not stop himself. The pull of the con, the rush of the trick, the need to take what was not his, it was all still there, gnawing at him. And so, hiding from the entire world, with everything to lose, he started running scams again anyway. Small ones at first, then bigger and bolder and more reckless, robbing people, stealing identities, taking insane risks for no reason other than that he could not help it. The compulsion that had ruined his life kept right on driving him even after it had cost him everything. And it was that compulsion, in the end, that got him caught. Gene pushed his luck one time too many, was recognized, and the law that had been hunting Saul Goodman for years finally closed its hand around him. This is where the whole long story comes to its final room, the place every step since that first wound from Chuck had been leading. Saul Goodman, caught at last, faced the full weight of everything he had done. The crimes stretched back years, tangled up with Walter White's empire of death, and they were enough to bury him for the rest of his life. He was looking at spending all his remaining days behind bars. And then he did the thing he had always done. He talked. Saul Goodman was the greatest talker who ever lived, and he turned that gift loose one final time in the most important negotiation of his life. He spun a story for the prosecutors. He painted himself as a victim, a frightened little man bullied and threatened, and forced into helping the monstrous Walter White against his will, a bystander swept up in someone else's evil. It was a brilliant performance, the work of a lifetime of cons, and it worked. He talked his sentence down from the rest of his life, all the way to 7 years. 7 years in a comfortable prison for everything he had done. He was about to get away with it, the way he always got away with it, about to slip free one last time on the strength of his own silver tongue. But on his way to sealing that easy deal, he reached for one more bargaining chip, and that chip changed everything. He let the prosecutors know that he had information about the death of Howard Hamlin, that he could tell them what really happened to the lawyer who vanished all those years ago, offering up Howard's death as one more card to play. And that was when he learned something that stopped him cold. Kim had already come forward. Kim, far away and trying to live an honest life, had been unable to carry the lie any longer. She had told the authorities the truth about what the two of them did to Howard, had written it all down, had confessed her own part in it, and faced what came with it. She had chosen, with nothing forcing her, to stop hiding and to own what she had done. The knowledge that Kim had told the truth, that she had chosen honesty, even when it cost her, reached the place inside Saul that nothing had touched in years, something in him that had been buried since the fire took. Chuck began, at last, to stir. In the courtroom, with the easy 7-year deal sitting right there for the taking, with Kim present in the room, Saul Goodman threw it all away. He stood up, and instead of the lie he had rehearsed, instead of the victim story that would set him nearly free, he told the truth. The whole truth. He confessed to everything. He admitted that he had not been Walter White's frightened victim, but his willing partner, that he had known exactly what he was doing the entire time, that he had helped a monster spread death across the city with his eyes wide open. He took responsibility for his role in Howard's death and for the cruelty that led to it. He even spoke of his brother, of Chuck, of the guilt he had run from for so long. He laid himself bare in front of the court, holding nothing back, hiding behind nothing. And he gave them a name. He told the courtroom that he was not Saul Goodman. He had them call him by the name he had thrown away years before, the name of his family, the name of his brother, the name of the man who had once worked in a mailroom and studied at night and wept when he finally passed the bar. He told them he was Jimmy McGill. By telling the truth, he gave up the 7-year deal completely. The court sentenced Jimmy McGill to 86 years in prison, more than the rest of any man's natural life. He chose it. He looked at a door that led almost to freedom, and he closed it with his own hand, and he walked the other way into a lifetime behind bars, because freedom as Saul Goodman was worth less to him than the truth was as Jimmy McGill. The greatest con man who ever lived ran his final con on no one but himself, and the trick was honesty. The whole story had been circling the question of regret, and it asked that question over and over near the end through a strange and simple game. Different people, across different moments in his life, had been asked what they would do with a time machine, where they would go, what they would change. The drug kingpin asked the question, could only think of money and business, A man with no real regrets worth naming. A hardened killer he once walked through the desert with had answered the question with quiet sorrow about the day he first stepped off the honest path and the family it cost him. And in one last flashback, the story returned to Chuck, alive again for a few quiet minutes, reading a book about a time machine in his lamplit house. Chuck, in that memory, gently told Jimmy that he did not have to keep coming around, that he should not make himself miserable trying to please others, and suggested, almost kindly, that it is never too late to change the road you are on. Jimmy, back then, brushed the words away and left. He did not understand them. It would take losing everything, and a lifetime, for him to finally prove his brother right about the one thing Chuck got wrong. Because Chuck, long ago, in the conversation that began this entire fall, had said something with total certainty. He had said that people do not change. He had said that Slippin' Jimmy would always be Slippin' Jimmy, that a man could never truly become anything better, and that belief had been the wound that started everything. For years, Jimmy seemed determined to prove Chuck right, sliding further and further down, becoming worse and worse, shedding his name and his conscience and his soul, until he was a hollow man hiding in an apron in a faraway city. Chuck looked like a prophet. People really do not change, the long fall seemed to say, and Jimmy was simply what he had always been. And then, in a courtroom, with everything on the line and freedom in his grasp, Jimmy McGill changed. He did the one thing Slippin' Jimmy could never do. He told the truth when a lie would have saved him. He accepted the punishment instead of slipping out from under it. He chose to be the worse off, honest version of himself over the comfortable, lying one. In the very last hour, with nothing left to gain and everything to lose, the man proved his brother wrong. People can change. It might take losing the whole world to do it. It might come far too late to undo any of the harm, but it can be done, and Jimmy did it. And he did it in front of Kim, so that the one person who had ever truly known him could see that the man she loved had been in there all along, buried but not gone. The last images the story leaves are quiet and almost gentle, a strange kind of peace at the bottom of a tragedy. Kim comes to visit Jimmy in prison. They stand together the way they used to, and they share a cigarette, passing it back and forth in the simple, familiar way of two people who once built a life together. There is no big speech, no grand reunion, just two people who hurt each other and the world terribly, sitting in the wreckage, connected one last time by something real. And as Kim leaves, she looks back at him through the fence, and he raises his hand and makes the little finger gun gesture they had always shared between them, a small private signal from the better days. It is the gesture of Jimmy McGill, not Saul Goodman. He will spend the rest of his life in a cell. He has lost his freedom, his money, his career, his fake names, everything he ever chased or built or hid behind. And somehow, stripped of all of it, locked away forever, he looks more like himself, more at peace, more whole than he has looked since the day his brother told him he never mattered. This is the answer. The whole long story was building toward the meaning underneath every step of the slow corruption of Jimmy McGill. The fall began with a wound, the day a brother said, "A good man could never be anything but a crook." It grew through 100 choices, each a little darker than the last. A forged document, a broken brother, a heartbroken old woman, a desert full of blood, a good man dead on a living room floor. Along the way, Jimmy threw away his very name, trading it for one built to feel nothing and owe nothing, and escape every weight a soul can carry. The name was the heart of the corruption. To become Saul Goodman was to try to stop being a person who could be hurt or held responsible, to slip free of family and guilt and love all at once. And the reckoning, when it finally came, was the exact reverse of that choice. In the end, Jimmy did the one thing Saul Goodman was built to never do. He picked the weight back up. He reached out and took back the name he had thrown away, the family name, the brother's name, and with the name he took back, everything that came attached to it. The guilt, the responsibility, the truth. He chose to be a person again, a person who could be punished, a person who had done real harm and would answer for it. The slow corruption had spent years carving Jimmy McGill down into Saul Goodman. The final hour reversed it in a single sentence spoken in a courtroom, when a man stood up and said his own true name. The corruption, it turns out, was never quite complete, never quite permanent, never quite the one-way road that Chuck's grim certainty made it seem. Something of the good man survived the whole long descent, buried so deep that it took the loss of everything to reach it, but alive down there the entire time waiting. The tragedy is how much had to be destroyed before that buried man could climb back into the light. A brother dead, a good lawyer dead, a marriage in ruins, a life behind bars. The price of digging Jimmy McGill back out from under Saul Goodman was nearly everything a person can have. He paid it. And whether that final, costly choice redeems the man who made it, or simply lets him die as himself instead of as a stranger, is the last and hardest question the whole story leaves, sitting in the quiet of that prison cell, waiting to be understood as everything that has come before settles into its final shape. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.